Hello everyone, if you enjoy this video, please hit that like button, drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'm on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support means the world to me, and let's get started. Before we get swept up in the whirlwind of Alexander's life, it's worth pausing to understand the ground he was standing on before he ever took his first step. Because the truth is, without Philip II, there would be no Alexander the Great. That might sound dramatic, but it's accurate. The empire Alexander would go on to carve across Asia was built on foundations laid by his father, sometimes in blood, sometimes in strategy, and often in a mixture of both. Let's be honest, Macedon was not always the glamorous, powerhouse kingdom that later historians like to paint it. For much of its early history, the Macedonians were seen by the southern Greek city-states, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, as half-barbarians, hill people with a knack for drinking and fighting but not much else. They lived on the northern edges of the Greek world, a borderland that was constantly harassed by Thracian raiders and Illyrian tribes. Macedon wasn't a democracy, either. It was a monarchy, and a shaky one at that. Kings ruled with absolute power in theory, but in practice they depended heavily on the loyalty of noble families, warrior aristocrats who could make or break a throne. This meant assassinations, betrayals, and coups were as common as festivals. The kingdom itself was divided into Upper and Lower Macedon, each with its own rival clans. Uniting it was like herding wolves. So, when Philip stepped onto the stage in the mid-4th century BCE, the kingdom was fractured, weak, and very vulnerable. In fact, by the time Philip took the throne in 359 BCE, Macedon was on the brink of collapse. His older brother Perdiccas III had just been killed in battle against the Illyrians, and Philip, who wasn't even the heir originally, suddenly found himself holding together a kingdom on the edge of ruin. Philip was about 23 years old when he became king. He had spent part of his youth as a hostage in Thebes, and though that might sound humiliating, it turned out to be the making of him. While in Thebes, he got a front-row seat to Greek military brilliance, particularly the innovative tactics of Theban generals like Epaminondas, who had smashed the Spartans at Leuctra. Philip studied their use of the phalanx, their reforms in training, and their emphasis on flexibility. When he returned to Macedon, he didn't just mimic these ideas, he improved them. He created what would later be called the Macedonian phalanx, outfitting his soldiers with sarissas, massive pikes that could reach up to 18 feet long. Imagine a wall of men, bristling with spears twice the length of their enemies. Once these pikes locked together in formation, they were almost impossible to break. It was both terrifying and brutally effective. But Philip wasn't just a military reformer. He was a political schemer of the highest order. He married strategically, building alliances with rival clans. He bought loyalty when he needed to, and when money didn't work, steel did. Slowly, he consolidated power, not just over Macedon, but over its neighbors. By the 350s BCE, Philip was no longer just holding Macedonia together, he was expanding it. He defeated the Illyrians, subdued the Thracians, and began pressing south into Thessaly. The southern Greek city-states, so often locked in their own squabbles, didn't realize until too late that Philip was building something far greater than a backwater kingdom. And here's where it gets interesting. Philip didn't just want power for power's sake. He had a vision, a united Greece under Macedonian leadership, marching together against Persia. This wasn't a random dream, either. For generations, Greek thinkers had talked about avenging the Persian invasions of the early 5th century. To Philip, Persia wasn't just a target, it was the justification for his entire project. Unite the Greeks, point them east, and suddenly his monarchy had a cause that transcended tribal squabbles. If there's one battle that summed up Philip's rise, it was Chaeronea in 338 BCE. Athens and Thebes, finally waking up to the threat he posed, joined forces to try to stop him. It was the classic matchup, the old city-states, proud of their traditions, against the new power rising in the north. Philip commanded the Macedonian center, but on one wing he placed his 18-year-old son, Alexander. That's right, Kyrenia wasn't just Philip's triumph, it was Alexander's coming out party. Philip's phalanx ground down the enemy, while Alexander, leading the elite companion cavalry, charged and broke the Theban sacred band, an elite unit that had never been defeated before. The battle ended in a decisive Macedonian victory, and from that moment on, Greek independence was finished. Philip didn't destroy the city-states. Instead, he created the League of Corinth, a federation of Greek states with himself as the leader. And what was its stated purpose? To invade Persia. The stage was set. Now, let's not pretend Philip was a flawless king. He was brilliant, yes, but he was also ruthless, unfaithful, and not exactly the most nurturing father. His relationship with Alexander was complicated. Alexander adored his mother Olympias, who despised Philip. Philip, for his part, seemed to both admire and fear his son's potential. There were moments of pride, like Kyrenia, but also bitter tensions, especially as Philip's court filled with new wives and political intrigue. And then, just as Philip's dream was about to be realized, just as the invasion of Persia was finally within reach, fate intervened. In 336 BCE, at a wedding banquet in Aegae, Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. To this day, historians argue whether it was personal revenge, a wider conspiracy, or even Olympias herself pulling strings. What's undeniable is that in that bloody moment, the weight of Philip's empire, the armies, the plans, the fragile unity of Greece, fell squarely onto the shoulders of his 20-year-old son, Alexander. That's the backdrop. Before Alexander ever swung a sword in Asia, he was walking in the footsteps of a father who had reshaped the Greek world and aimed its gaze eastward. Alexander inherited not just a throne, but a loaded cannon, pointed at Persia and ready to fire. If Alexander's father, Philip, gave him the tools and the stage, his mother, Olympias, gave him the fire, and perhaps the conviction that he wasn't entirely human. To understand Alexander, you can't skip over Olympias, because she wasn't just any queen. She was a storm, a mystery, a woman cloaked in snakes and rumors, and the one who filled her son's head with the idea that he might be destined for more than a mortal life. Olympias was born a princess of Epirus, a rugged land west of Macedon, filled with mountains, tribal kings, and ancient traditions. She was of the Molossian royal line, which traced its ancestry back to the hero Achilles himself. That wasn't just family bragging rights, it mattered deeply in a world where myth and history blurred. For Alexander, the idea that he carried the blood of Achilles through his mother was more than a story, it was an identity he would cling to all his life. Now, Olympias was not a soft-spoken woman content to sit quietly in the background. Contemporary writers, especially those unfriendly to powerful women, often painted her as wild, vengeful, and even sinister. She was deeply religious, a devotee of the mystery cult of Dionysus, where snakes slithered through ceremonies, drums pounded, and worshippers reached ecstatic frenzies. Some said she slept with snakes in her bed, a detail that might be exaggerated, but you can see how such rumors took root. For a boy like Alexander, raised at her knee, Olympias's intense personality was a crucible. She told him he was special, divinely favored, even, and she didn't whisper it. She declared it. Here's where the myths get juicy. Later stories, and let's admit, Macedonian gossip loved a good myth, claim that on the night before her wedding to Philip, Olympias dreamed that a thunderbolt struck her womb, setting it ablaze. Other versions say Philip himself dreamed of sealing his wife's womb with a lion's emblem, a sign that their child would be bold and powerful. The most famous rumor, though, was that Alexander was not Philip's son at all, but Zeus's. According to legend, a snake, or Zeus in snake form, depending on who you asked, lay with Olympias. When Philip peeked into her chamber and saw the serpent beside her, he was terrified. Some said from then on, he kept a distance from her bed. Now, did Philip believe these tales? Probably not. But Olympias? She leaned into them. To her, Alexander was not just the child of a king, he was born of gods. And Alexander, growing up in her shadow, absorbed every drop of that belief. Imagine being told as a boy that you weren't merely human. It sticks. But Olympias wasn't just shaping Alexander's divine image, she was also shaping his rivalry with his father. Philip, as brilliant as he was, had a weakness for women and political marriages. Every union he made was a strategic alliance, and that meant Olympias was constantly competing for influence at court. When Philip married Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian noblewoman, unlike Olympias, who was from Epirus, the palace tension boiled over. Cleopatra's uncle Attalus insulted Alexander directly at a banquet, calling him a bastard, not truly fit to inherit the throne, since Olympias was foreign. Alexander, hot-tempered even as a teenager, threw his wine cup and insulted Attalus. Philip, drunk, actually drew his sword and staggered at his own son, nearly killing him before tumbling to the ground. That night, Alexander and Olympias fled the court, she to Epirus, he to Illyria, until a reconciliation was forced. But the damage was done. Alexander's relationship with his father was permanently scarred, while his bond with his mother only deepened. Olympias had always been his fiercest supporter, and after that public humiliation, Alexander knew where his true loyalty lay. Looking back, you can see how Olympias planted seeds that would bloom throughout Alexander's campaigns. When he later claimed descent from Achilles, or when he sought recognition as the son of Zeus Ammon at the Oracle of Siwa in Egypt, these weren't sudden bursts of arrogance. They were the continuation of a narrative Olympias had been weaving since his birth. For Alexander, conquering Persia, riding at the head of phalanxes, even daring to call himself divine, it wasn't hubris, not in his mind. It was destiny. And destiny, as his mother had told him again and again, was his birthright. So, was Alexander really the son of Zeus? Of course not. But here's the thing, in the ancient world, belief was power. And when tens of thousands of soldiers believed their king was touched by the gods, when enemies quaked at rumors of his divine heritage, when Alexander himself carried himself as if the world owed him its submission, well, myth and reality blurred. And who started that? Not Philip, the hard-nosed strategist. It was Olympias, the woman of fire and snakes, who convinced her son and everyone around him that he was born to greatness. If Philip built the empire's body, Olympias gave it its soul. And together, they produced a boy who was convinced he was destined to be more than human, a boy who would soon prove it on the battlefield. If Olympias gave Alexander his sense of destiny and Philip gave him an empire ready to launch, what molded him day by day? What sharpened him into the figure who could actually carry out such lofty dreams? Here's where the story shifts from myths and palace intrigue to the training ground. Because young Alexander wasn't just spoiled with stories of Zeus and Achilles, he was forged in the saddle, in the classroom, and in the company of some of the greatest minds of his age. Let's start with the horse, because that's the tale everyone remembers. Somewhere around the age of 12 or 13, Alexander was present when a magnificent but unmanageable stallion was brought before Philip. The horse was enormous, fiery, and completely out of control, biting, kicking, refusing to be mounted. No one could handle it, and Philip, frustrated, was ready to send it away. Alexander, though, wasn't impressed with the adults giving up. He noticed something: the horse wasn't vicious, it was afraid. Its own shadow spooked it. So Alexander walked calmly up, turned the horse toward the sun so its shadow was behind it, and stroked its neck until it relaxed. Then, in front of everyone, he mounted it and rode it across the field, controlling the beast that had terrified seasoned grooms. Philip, stunned, supposedly exclaimed, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you." And just like that, Alexander earned more than a horse. He earned Bucephalus, his companion in war for decades. The story became a symbol of his character, seeing what others missed, daring to try, and turning fear into mastery. Not long after, Philip made another decision that would shape Alexander forever. He hired Aristotle to tutor his son. Yes, that Aristotle, the student of Plato, the man whose writings would influence philosophy for centuries. Imagine being a teenager and your private teacher is one of the greatest thinkers who ever lived. The lessons weren't just about memorizing facts. Aristotle gave Alexander a worldview. He taught him ethics, logic, rhetoric, medicine, poetry, and natural sciences. He also gave him Homer. For Alexander, Homer's Iliad wasn't just literature, it was scripture. He carried a copy annotated by Aristotle on his campaigns, sleeping with it under his pillow. Achilles, the warrior hero, became not only a role model but also a shadow he longed to surpass. But Aristotle wasn't just filling Alexander's head with Greek culture. He also taught him to observe the world, to study plants, animals, and geography. Later, as Alexander marched into Asia, he sent back specimens and reports to his old tutor, like a field researcher who happened to command armies. That said, their relationship wasn't without tension. Aristotle was a philosopher who believed in a clear divide between Greeks and barbarians. Alexander, as he grew older, began rejecting this sharp line, adopting Persian customs and merging cultures. It's one of those ironies of history: the student outgrew the master, but the foundation remained. Alexander's education wasn't confined to scrolls and lectures. Philip made sure his son learned the art of kingship the hard way, through responsibility. When Philip was off campaigning, Alexander was left as regent in Macedon, even as a teenager. In one case, he had to put down a revolt in Thrace, which he did decisively, proving to everyone, and perhaps himself, that he wasn't just a boy with books and a horse, he could command men. He also fought alongside Philip in real battles. At the age of 16, he was already leading troops, learning the rhythm of the phalanx, the thunder of cavalry charges, the panic of sudden retreats. By the time most boys his age were worrying about chores or tutors, Alexander was experiencing the chaos of war firsthand. Life at court also surrounded Alexander with companions who would become key players in his later campaigns, some as loyal allies, some as rivals. Hephaestion, often described as Alexander's closest friend, and perhaps more than a friend, was at his side from youth. Their bond would become legendary, compared by some to Achilles and Patroclus. But court life also meant competition. Other noble youths jostled for favor, and Alexander's quick temper sometimes flared. He was ambitious, proud, and unwilling to be treated as anything less than destined for greatness. It didn't always make him easy company, but it made him unforgettable. It's hard not to notice how perfectly all these threads came together: a fiery mother who told him he was divine, a brilliant father who built a war machine, a legendary horse that became his partner, and a philosopher who handed him both Homeric heroism and scientific curiosity. Was Alexander destined for greatness? Or was he just the product of an environment that constantly told him he was destined, until he made it so? Maybe both. But by the time he was a teenager, the outlines of the conqueror were already there. He was restless, brilliant, daring, and convinced the world was waiting for him. Bucephalus beneath him, Homer in his hand, Aristotle's voice in his mind, and Olympias's whisper of destiny in his ear, that's the Alexander who stepped out of youth and into history. Alexander didn't have the luxury of being just a prince lounging in palace gardens, sipping wine, and waiting for his crown. Philip II wasn't that kind of father, and Macedon wasn't that kind of kingdom. From a young age, Alexander was tossed into the rough-and-tumble world of politics, war, and responsibility. And the truth is, he thrived in it. This chapter is where the boy begins to look suspiciously like the man he would become. Picture this: you're 16 years old. Most kids your age are still figuring out who they are. Alexander? He was left in charge of an entire kingdom. When Philip marched off on one of his endless campaigns, Alexander was appointed regent of Macedon, essentially acting king. It wasn't just a ceremonial role. A Thracian tribe called the Madi revolted, perhaps thinking they could take advantage of a teenager's inexperience. Alexander didn't hesitate. He gathered an army, marched against them, crushed the rebellion, and, just for good measure, founded a city on their land, naming it Alexandropolis. Yes, even as a teenager, he was already stamping his name on the map. That early campaign proved two things: 1, Alexander had inherited his father's military instinct, and 2, he wasn't afraid to act decisively, even ruthlessly. The Mede expected a boy, they got a commander. It wasn't long before Alexander went from governing at home to fighting alongside his father. At 18, he stood on the field at Kyrenia in 338 BCE, one of the most significant battles in Greek history. The Greek city-states, Athens and Thebes in particular, had finally realized Philip's ambitions threatened their independence. They set aside their rivalries long enough to meet the Macedonians in battle. The stakes? Control of Greece itself. Philip commanded the center of his phalanx, but he placed his son Alexander on the left wing, in charge of the elite companion cavalry. This wasn't a "let the boy watch" assignment. This was real responsibility. During the battle, Alexander reportedly led a decisive cavalry charge that smashed the Theban sacred band, an elite unit of 300 warriors who had a reputation for being invincible. The fact that Alexander played a role in breaking them made his reputation skyrocket. The victory at Kyrenia wasn't just Philip's, it was a joint father-son triumph. But for Alexander, it was also the first taste of battlefield glory, the intoxicating sense of being at the very center of history. But here's the thing: as much as Kyrenia showcased Alexander's brilliance, it also widened the gulf between him and Philip. Imagine being a teenager, hearing soldiers chant your name, seeing respect in the eyes of hardened veterans, and then returning to a court where your father's new wife and her family openly question your legitimacy. Remember the infamous banquet? Attalus, the uncle of Philip's latest bride Cleopatra Eurydice, raised a toast hoping for a legitimate Macedonian heir. Everyone knew what that meant: an heir not tainted by Olympias's foreign blood. Alexander, never one to let an insult pass, hurled a cup at him. Philip, drunk and furious, drew his sword to strike his son but stumbled, falling in the process. Alexander stormed out, Olympias at his side, and for a while they both went into exile. For Alexander, that was betrayal on two fronts, by Attalus's insult and by his own father's attempt to attack him. His bond with Olympias grew tighter, while his admiration for Philip curdled into resentment. And yet, their destinies were still bound together. After Kyrenia, Philip set up the League of Corinth, a coalition of Greek states, with Sparta as the one holdout. Philip was declared hegemon, leader of Greece, and his grand plan became official: the invasion of Persia. Here's the twist: Alexander was watching all this closely. He saw the machinery of empire being built, and he was a part of it, but he also saw that he wasn't the architect. That was Philip. For a young man convinced of his own divine destiny, playing second fiddle, even to his father, wasn't easy. By the time he was 20, Alexander had already served as regent of Macedon, crushed a rebellion and founded a city, led cavalry at Kyrenia and broken one of Greece's most legendary units, experienced the bitter politics of succession and betrayal within his own family. It was a resume that would have been impressive for a lifetime, and Alexander was barely out of his teens. The boy who tamed Bucephalus had become a prince who commanded armies. And then, just when Philip was preparing to lead Greece into Persia, the banquet at Aegae changed everything. A dagger, a fallen king, and a young man suddenly vaulted into history. Alexander's first taste of command wasn't just a warm-up act. It was the foundation of the legend. The teenager who had already conquered tribes and won battles was about to inherit not just a throne, but the most ambitious military project in the ancient world. The banquet at Aegae in 336 BCE was supposed to be a celebration, a dazzling showcase of Macedonian strength and Philip II's unstoppable rise. Instead, it turned into one of the most shocking assassinations of the ancient world, a moment when joy turned to chaos, when the conqueror of Greece fell to a dagger, and when a 20-year-old prince suddenly became the most powerful man in the Hellenic world. By this point, Philip II stood at the height of his career. He had reformed Macedonia into a military juggernaut, united Greece under the League of Corinth, and was already planning his invasion of Persia. Everything he had worked toward was within his grasp. And yet, Philip was also surrounded by tension. His court seethed with intrigue, multiple wives, rival factions, offended nobles, and ambitious generals. Macedonian politics was never a safe game, and Philip's constant maneuvering meant enemies lurked in every corner of his palace. The occasion at Aegae was meant to be glorious. It was the wedding of Philip's daughter Cleopatra, not to be confused with his wife Cleopatra Eurydice, to King Alexander of Epirus, Olympias's own brother. That detail alone should make you pause. Olympias's family was being honored, but Olympias herself had been sidelined since Philip's new marriage. The atmosphere was celebratory, but beneath the surface, dangerous currents swirled. The man who struck the fatal blow was Pausanias of Orestes, one of Philip's own bodyguards. On the surface, it looked like a personal grudge. Pausanias had once been insulted and humiliated at court, and Philip hadn't defended him. He carried the bitterness for years, and when the chance came, he seized it. As Philip entered the theater in Aegae, surrounded by his entourage, Pausanias rushed forward and stabbed him to death. It was quick, brutal, and public. The king who had defeated armies and humbled Greece fell not in battle, but at the hands of a single man. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Pausanias tried to escape but was killed almost instantly by Philip's guards. No interrogation, no trial. Convenient, isn't it? Which is why questions about the assassination have haunted history ever since. Was it really just personal revenge? Or was Pausanias a pawn in a much larger plot? Theories abounded even in antiquity. Some pointed at Olympias, whose jealousy and resentment of Philip's new marriage were well known. Others suspected Alexander himself, who had clashed bitterly with his father in recent years and may have seen no future for himself if Philip lived long enough to produce a pure Macedonian heir with Cleopatra Eurydice. Then again, it could have been a conspiracy among Philip's political enemies, perhaps even with Persian backing, since Philip's invasion plans were no secret. The truth? We'll probably never know. What we do know is that Alexander was well positioned to benefit from his father's death, and Olympias wasted no time in making sure no rival threatened her son. Imagine being 20 years old and suddenly inheriting not just a kingdom, but an empire in waiting. Alexander acted with astonishing speed. Macedonian succession wasn't automatic, the army and nobility had to support the new king, and rivals were everywhere. Alexander made sure there would be no rivals. Olympias orchestrated the brutal elimination of Cleopatra Eurydice's infant child, Philip's newborn heir, and drove Cleopatra herself to suicide. Other claimants, real or imagined, were swiftly cut down. It was bloody, but it was effective. Alexander was king, and no one dared dispute it. Then, he moved to secure loyalty. He addressed the Macedonian army, reminding them of Kyrenia, of his campaigns, of his place at Philip's side in war. The soldiers, already impressed with the prince who had led them in battle, swore their allegiance. Macedon had a new king, Alexander III. The news of Philip's death sent shockwaves across Greece. The city-states that had been forced into the League of Corinth under Macedonian dominance suddenly saw an opportunity. Wasn't this the moment to shake off Macedonian control? Surely a 20-year-old couldn't hold the empire together. Thebes and Athens began to stir, whispering about rebellion. Thracian tribes in the north sensed weakness. Persia itself may have smiled at the news. But Alexander wasn't about to let anyone test him. He marched fast, first north to crush the Illyrians and Thracians who threatened his borders, then south into Greece itself. His message was simple: the boy king was no boy. And when Thebes dared to rise in revolt, Alexander burned the city to the ground. Thebes, once one of the greatest powers in Greece, was obliterated in a single act of ferocious determination. Athens, terrified, backed down. Greece was cowed into silence. The League of Corinth remained intact, this time with Alexander at its head. Philip had dreamed of conquering Persia. Alexander inherited not only the dream but the army and the political machinery to carry it out. But unlike his father, Alexander carried something else, a burning belief in his divine destiny, a conviction that Persia wasn't just a target, it was his destiny. In the blood-stained theater of Igi, a chapter had closed. The builder was gone. The conqueror was about to begin. When the dagger struck Philip down, the world thought Macedon would crumble. A 20-year-old king, untested in diplomacy, hemmed in by rivals, surrounded by older generals, surely this was the moment Greece would break free. Surely Persia could rest easy. Surely the whole Macedonian machine would stall. But Alexander wasn't the type to let things fall apart. He moved with the speed of lightning, and in doing so, showed the world that Philip's death wasn't the end of Macedon's rise, it was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The first order of business was simple: eliminate threats. Macedonian succession wasn't like a smooth hereditary monarchy in later Europe, it was a knife-edge affair, where noble factions and rival claimants could tear the kingdom apart overnight. Olympias, ever the firebrand, made sure Philip's new wife Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant daughter didn't survive long enough to become symbols for opposition. The stories vary. Some say Olympias forced Cleopatra to hang herself after killing the child, others that it was done even more brutally, but the message was clear: no one would stand in Alexander's way. Alexander also had to reassure and reward the companions, the elite circle of nobles and generals who had served under Philip. Many of them were older men who could have brushed him aside. Instead, Alexander flattered them, gave them new honors, and, importantly, reminded them of his battlefield record. They hadn't just heard stories of him, they had fought beside him. He made them see that backing him wasn't a gamble, it was the safest bet. The Macedonian army was Philip's masterpiece, and without its loyalty, Alexander was nothing. He acted fast, addressing the troops directly, promising continuity with Philip's vision but also adding something new, a sense of destiny. He reminded them of Cheironeia, of his youth spent in command, and of the spoils that awaited them in Asia. Soldiers are practical men, they cared about pay, plunder, and glory. Alexander promised them all three, and he delivered the kind of speech that made them believe. By the end, the army roared its approval. The throne was his. But outside Macedon, the Greeks weren't convinced. The city-states had lived under Macedonian domination uneasily, forced into the League of Corinth by Philip. Now that he was gone, they sensed their chance. Thebes, in particular, was ready to resist. Athens murmured in the background, weighing its options. Sparta, never really comfortable with Macedonian leadership, watched with interest. In short, the whole Greek world was on edge, waiting to see if Alexander would falter. He didn't give them the chance. Alexander marched his army south with terrifying speed. First, he dealt with trouble in Thrace and Illyria, crushing northern tribes to show he could protect Macedon's borders. Then, hearing that Thebes had revolted, he pivoted south like a storm unleashed. When he arrived outside Thebes, the city braced for a siege, believing Alexander would hesitate, negotiate, or at least drag things out. But Alexander attacked decisively. His phalanx stormed the walls, his cavalry poured through breaches, and within days Thebes was overwhelmed. What followed was brutal, even by the standards of ancient war. Thebes, one of Greece's great powers, was razed to the ground. Its citizens were slaughtered or sold into slavery, its buildings leveled, and its territory divided among allies. Only the house of Pindar, the poet, was spared, supposedly out of respect for art. The destruction sent shockwaves across Greece. Athens, which had considered rising against Macedon, immediately backed down. Other city-states fell silent. No one wanted to share Thebes's fate. After this show of force, Alexander convened the League of Corinth again. The Greeks, now thoroughly cowed, renewed their allegiance. They confirmed him as hegemon of the League, granting him supreme command for the campaign against Persia. In one stroke, Alexander had secured his throne, silenced opposition, and positioned himself as the leader of all Greece. It's tempting to see Alexander's destruction of Thebes as cold cruelty, but it was also calculated. He needed to prove, immediately and unequivocally, that he wasn't just Philip's boy, he was a king in his own right, and a dangerous one. By destroying one city, he saved himself years of constant uprisings. It was also a personal statement. The same sacred band Alexander had helped defeat at Kyrenia had been Theban. To annihilate the city that once mocked Macedon was to erase a rival's pride forever. By 335 BCE, Alexander had transformed from a precarious young claimant into an undisputed king. His enemies were dead or subdued, his army was loyal, and Greece was united, terrified, but united. Now, with his back secure, he could turn to the east, to the empire his father had dreamed of conquering. Persia, the vast, glittering giant that had loomed over Greece for centuries, was waiting. And Alexander, barely out of his teens, was ready to strike. With Greece subdued and his throne secure, Alexander could finally turn to the mission that had hovered over his life like a torch passed from father to son, the conquest of Persia. To the Greeks, Persia wasn't just another rival power, it was the great enemy, the shadow that had loomed ever since the days of Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. To Alexander, it was more than that. It was the stage on which he would prove himself worthy of the legends he'd grown up idolizing. Let's rewind a little. For Philip, Persia had always been the ultimate goal. He wasn't content with just ruling Greece, he wanted revenge for the Persian invasions of the past and, just as importantly, he wanted to harness Greek unity against a common foe. The League of Corinth had been created with one purpose: to march east. Philip's assassination interrupted those plans. But Alexander, inheriting not just the throne but the dream, was determined to see it through. Except in his mind, it wasn't just about avenging Greece. It was about proving himself the greatest conqueror who had ever lived. Where Philip might have sought wealth and power, Alexander sought immortality. It's easy to think of Persia as this untouchable colossus, but by Alexander's time, the empire wasn't what it had once been. Stretching from Asia Minor to Egypt to the edges of India, it was vast, too vast, some might say. Its king, Darius III, wasn't particularly strong or charismatic, and satraps, provincial governors, often acted independently. Persia's armies were still formidable, but they were stitched together from dozens of subject peoples, harder to coordinate than Macedon's drilled and disciplined troops. To Alexander, this wasn't just a daunting empire. It was an empire ripe for the taking. Before he could march east, Alexander had to make sure his own kingdom was secure. In 335 BCE, he led lightning campaigns north against the Illyrians and Thracians, pushing Macedonian power deep into the Balkans. These were brutal, fast-moving strikes, meant to terrify rivals into submission. It worked. No one wanted to tangle with the young king again. Macedon's northern frontier was safe, and the army had been blooded. It was time. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander marched to the edge of Europe, to the narrow strait of the Hellespont, modern Dardanelles. Here, the symbolic and the strategic merged. Crossing into Asia wasn't just a military move, it was a declaration. And Alexander, ever the showman, made it unforgettable. Before stepping onto Asian soil, he sailed to the legendary ruins of Troy. He sacrificed to Athena, visited the tombs of the heroes, and hung his armor in the temple of Athena while taking a sacred shield said to be from the Trojan War. Standing at Achilles' supposed burial mound, he ran naked in ritual homage, declaring himself the new Achilles. To his soldiers, this wasn't just theater, it was powerful myth-making. Their king wasn't just invading Persia. He was walking in the footsteps of Homer's greatest hero. Let's not forget the practical side. Alexander didn't march alone. He led around 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, a relatively small force compared to the might of Persia, but one that was drilled to perfection. The Macedonian phalanx with its long sarissas formed the backbone. The elite companion cavalry, personally led by Alexander, gave him shock power. Add to that Greek allies, mercenaries, and skilled light infantry, and you had an army built for speed, discipline, and devastating effectiveness. This wasn't a lumbering force, it was a scalpel. And Alexander knew exactly how to wield it. What's fascinating is how Alexander framed this invasion. Yes, it was a war of conquest. Yes, he wanted Persia's wealth and power. But more than anything, he presented it as a war of honor, a continuation of the Greek struggle against Persia, a chance to avenge the burning of Athens a century and a half earlier. But privately? Privately, it was also about him. He wasn't marching to finish Philip's war. He was marching to become Alexander the Great. As his army landed on Asian soil, Persian satraps were already gathering forces to meet him. They assumed this young Macedonian would be easy prey. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The moment Alexander's boots hit Asian soil, the war was no longer theory or dream. It was real. And the Persians weren't about to let some upstart Macedonian prince stroll into their empire without resistance. The first test came quickly, on the banks of the Granicus River, in May 334 BCE. This was the battle where Alexander would show his army, and the world, that he wasn't just Philip's son continuing a campaign. He was a commander in his own right, fearless, audacious, and terrifyingly effective. News of Alexander's crossing spread fast. The Persian satraps, governors, of Asia Minor scrambled to gather their forces. They weren't unified under Darius just yet, this was more like a regional defense. But they had numbers on their side, perhaps 20,000 cavalry and 20,000 infantry, bolstered by a contingent of Greek mercenaries. Their plan was simple: stop Alexander cold at the river, crush his small army before it could get a foothold in Asia, and send him limping back to Europe. And honestly, it wasn't a bad plan. Macedon had fewer men, and the Persians knew the terrain. The Granicus itself, with its steep banks and fast current, gave them an advantage. Alexander's force was smaller, roughly 13,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry in this opening engagement. But here's the thing, his army was a finely tuned machine. Phalanx infantry with their sarissas formed the core, an immovable wall of spears. Companion cavalry, Alexander's pride and joy, offered the shock power. Light troops and archers gave him flexibility. And above all, the army had Alexander himself. He didn't just command from the rear. He led from the front, in gleaming armor, making himself both the most inspiring figure and the biggest target on the field. The Persians lined up along the opposite bank of the Granicus. It was a daring position, cavalry massed along the edge, infantry further back. Crossing a river under fire is one of the hardest maneuvers in warfare. Many of Alexander's generals advised caution: why not wait, find a better crossing point, or bait the Persians into moving? Alexander refused. He insisted on attacking immediately. His reasoning? A delay would sap morale and make the Persians look stronger. A bold strike would shock them and prove his men invincible. So, with trumpets blaring, he ordered his cavalry forward, straight into the current. The charge was chaos. Horses splashed through the river, men struggled up the slippery bank, while Persian cavalry rained down missiles. But Alexander drove forward, personally leading the companion cavalry. In the melee, Alexander was nearly killed. He clashed with Persian nobles in single combat, his helmet split open by a blow. A Persian named Spithridates raised an axe to deliver a killing strike, only for Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's closest companions, to cut him down in the nick of time. Alexander lived, but it was a reminder: he didn't just risk his men's lives. He risked his own every time. Once the companion cavalry gained the bank, the tide shifted. Macedonian infantry poured across, their long spears driving into Persian ranks. The Persian cavalry, brave but disorganized, broke under the relentless assault. Soon the mercenary infantry, the Greek hoplites fighting for Persia, stood isolated. Here's where things turned grim. The Greek mercenaries offered to surrender after the Persian cavalry fled. But Alexander, perhaps wanting to send a brutal message, refused. He ordered a full assault. The phalanx cut them down mercilessly, slaughtering thousands. Only a few were spared and sent in chains back to Greece, paraded as traitors. The massacre wasn't just cruelty, it was psychological warfare. By annihilating Greek mercenaries in Persian service, Alexander was warning the rest of Greece, fight for Persia, and you'll pay with your life. The victory at the Granicus opened Asia Minor to Alexander. City after city began to fall or surrender, intimidated by the speed and ferocity of his success. Sardis, one of the richest Persian cities, handed itself over without a fight. The message was clear: the Persians weren't invincible. This young Macedonian king had crossed the Hellespont, faced the empire's satraps head-on, and crushed them in his very first battle on their soil. It wasn't just a military triumph. It was a statement of intent. Alexander wasn't here to nibble at the edges of the Persian Empire. He was here to take it. The Granicus also revealed something about Alexander's style that would repeat again and again: audacity, attacking across a river that most generals would avoid. Personal courage, leading from the front, nearly dying, and inspiring loyalty through example. Ruthlessness, slaughtering mercenaries to cement his reputation. He wasn't cautious. He wasn't conventional. He was bold, brilliant, and terrifyingly willing to gamble. The Granicus was just the opening act. But if Persia thought it was dealing with another ambitious warlord, they were wrong. What began at that river would roll forward, city after city, battle after battle, until the empire itself trembled. The victory at the Granicus opened the floodgates. With the Persian satraps scattered and their cavalry humiliated, Alexander had his foothold in Asia. But conquering an empire wasn't just about winning flashy river battles. It was about grinding persistence, taking cities, breaking fortresses, and forcing submission one stronghold at a time. His march south through Asia Minor in 334 BCE showed another side of his genius: not just the battlefield commander, but the strategist and relentless besieger. After the Granicus, city after city along the western coast of Asia Minor began to fall in line. Some surrendered willingly, eager to switch sides once Persian power seemed fragile. Sardis, the wealthy capital of Lydia, simply opened its gates and declared allegiance to Alexander. For a man obsessed with both glory and pragmatism, this was perfect: no blood spilled, but a huge prize gained. Other cities required persuasion, or something closer to intimidation. The Ionian Greek cities, long under Persian control, saw Alexander as a liberator. He promised them autonomy, the restoration of democratic governments, and freedom from Persian-appointed tyrants. It was a clever move. He wasn't just conquering, he was presenting himself as the champion of Greek liberty. But not every city rolled over. Some dug in their heels. And none resisted more fiercely than Halicarnassus. Halicarnassus, modern Bodrum, Turkey, was no ordinary city. It was heavily fortified, defended by Persian forces under the command of Memnon of Rhodes, one of the most capable Greek mercenary generals in Persian service. Memnon was clever, resourceful, and one of the few men who might have been able to slow Alexander's momentum. Halicarnassus's walls were massive, its harbor protected by strong fortifications. For Alexander, it wasn't just another city, it was a test. Could he break a fortress defended by a skilled enemy commander? Alexander laid siege to the city, constructing siege engines and battering rams. His engineers worked tirelessly, building towers to rival Halicarnassus's walls. But Memnon and his troops fought back fiercely, launching sorties, setting fire to siege works, and defending every breach with deadly resistance. At one point, Alexander himself led an assault, storming forward under a hail of missiles. He was everywhere at once, directing troops, leading attacks, shouting encouragement. But Halicarnassus refused to fall easily. Eventually, after weeks of brutal fighting, parts of the city were set ablaze, either by Macedonian assault or by the defenders themselves retreating to the citadels. Memnon realized he couldn't hold the city indefinitely. So he pulled his forces back into 2 strong fortresses, hoping to maintain a presence while the rest of the city burned. Alexander entered the ruins, victorious but not entirely satisfied. Halicarnassus had been a grind, a costly and stubborn resistance. Still, he had won. The fortresses were eventually abandoned, and Halicarnassus was neutralized as a Persian base. Even in defeat, Memnon remained a thorn in Alexander's side. He escaped Halicarnassus with much of his fleet intact and would later launch counteroffensives in the Aegean, threatening Alexander's supply lines. He was, in many ways, the kind of opponent Alexander respected, a man who fought intelligently, not just bravely. But for now, Asia Minor's southern coast was open. With Halicarnassus behind him, Alexander continued his march along the coast. He didn't just conquer, he reorganized. In city after city, he dismantled Persian garrisons, installed new governments, and secured supply lines. He treated allies with generosity, punishing only those who resisted. This was key to his success. Alexander wasn't fighting just with force of arms, he was fighting with propaganda. To the Greeks of Asia Minor, he wasn't an invader. He was a liberator, restoring freedom after Persian rule. That story, true or not, helped keep cities opening their gates instead of closing them. The campaign through Asia Minor set a pattern that would define Alexander's conquests: relentless speed, he moved too fast for enemies to regroup. Calculated brutality, cities that resisted were punished harshly, like Halicarnassus, ensuring others thought twice. Political theater, he always positioned himself as a liberator, not a conqueror. Adaptability, whether it was open battle, mountain tribes, or siege warfare, he adjusted tactics constantly. By the end of 334 BCE, Alexander had secured Western Asia Minor. The Persian satraps were in disarray, their defenses crumbling. But this was only the beginning. The true test, the confrontation with Darius III himself, still lay ahead. And as Alexander looked east, toward the heart of the empire, he must have felt the thrill of inevitability. He wasn't just marching through provinces anymore. He was marching toward destiny. By the autumn of 333 BCE, the war against Persia had escalated from regional skirmishes and sieges to something far greater, the first direct confrontation between Alexander and King Darius III himself. The battle would take place near the small town of Issus, in southern Asia Minor, wedged between mountains and the sea. This wasn't just another engagement. It was the first time Alexander would face the great king, the man who commanded the wealth, armies, and prestige of the Persian Empire. And in true dramatic fashion, the battle unfolded like a clash between two worlds, one small but sharp, the other vast but unwieldy. Darius had initially underestimated Alexander, treating him like a nuisance to be swatted by satraps. But the defeats at the Granicus and the fall of Asia Minor had made it clear, this Macedonian youth was a real threat. So Darius gathered his forces. And when I say gathered, I mean tens of thousands upon tens of thousands, Persian cavalry, infantry, and, crucially, a large contingent of Greek mercenaries. Ancient sources inflate the numbers wildly, some claiming hundreds of thousands. More realistic estimates put it around 70,000 to 100,000 Persians against Alexander's 40,000 or so Macedonians. Still, the Persians had the advantage in numbers. The plan? Trap Alexander in Cilicia, cut off his supply lines, and crush him between the mountains and the sea. Here's the twist: Darius chose his battlefield poorly. Instead of waiting on the open plains of Mesopotamia, where his numbers could stretch wide, he advanced north into the narrow coastal plain near Issus. The terrain forced his massive army into a bottleneck, squeezed between the mountains and the sea. For Alexander, this was perfect. In a confined space, his smaller but more disciplined army had the advantage. The phalanx could hold firm, and the companion cavalry could smash into the Persians without being swarmed. The armies faced each other across the Panaris River. Darius placed his Greek mercenaries in the center, with Persian cavalry on the wings. He positioned himself in a grand chariot, surrounded by his elite guard, certain his presence would inspire victory. Alexander, as always, took command of the right wing, personally leading the companion cavalry. His plan was classic: hold firm in the center and left, while he delivered the decisive blow on the right. The battle opened with fierce fighting at the river. The Macedonian phalanx surged forward, clashing with Darius's mercenaries in brutal, close-quarters combat. Spears splintered, shields locked, and men hacked at each other in the shallow water. The Persian cavalry pressed hard on the Macedonian left, threatening to overwhelm it. But Alexander, on the right, charged. With his companions at his side, Alexander led a thunderous cavalry assault directly against the Persian left wing, driving them back and then wheeling inward toward the center, straight at Darius himself. Imagine the scene: Alexander, gleaming in his armor, his horse Bucephalus surging forward, the young king's spear leveled at the great king of Persia. For Darius, it was too much. Panic set in. Terrified of capture, or death, he turned his chariot and fled the field. When the king fled, the Persian army's morale shattered. Soldiers who had fought bravely suddenly broke, their confidence evaporating. The Macedonians surged forward, cutting them down. What had begun as a clash of equals ended in a rout. The Persian casualties were staggering. Tens of thousands were killed or captured, while Macedonian losses were relatively light. But the most shocking prize of all wasn't on the battlefield, it was in Darius's abandoned camp. There, Alexander found Darius's family, his mother, wife, and children, left behind in the hasty flight. According to the sources, they were terrified, believing Alexander would kill or abuse them. Instead, he treated them with respect, ensuring their safety and even showing deference to the Queen Mother. This was both genuine courtesy, Alexander prided himself on magnanimity, and shrewd politics. By treating Darius's family honorably, he contrasted himself with the king who had abandoned them. To Persians watching closely, the message was clear: who was the real king here, the man who ran, or the one who protected? In the aftermath of Issus, Darius tried to salvage the situation. He sent envoys offering peace, ransom for his family, and even territorial concessions. Alexander refused. He demanded nothing less than recognition as the ruler of all Asia. For Alexander, this wasn't about compromise. This was about conquest. The Battle of Issus was a turning point for several reasons: psychological impact. The image of Darius fleeing before Alexander was seared into history. The great king had been humiliated. Political leverage: by capturing Darius's family and treating them well, Alexander claimed the moral high ground. Momentum: the road to the Levant and Egypt now lay open. Persian resistance in Asia Minor was broken. Issus wasn't the end of Persia, but it was the moment the world began to believe Alexander might actually pull off the impossible. Think about it: in less than 2 years, a 20-something Macedonian had crossed into Asia, defeated the satraps at Granicus, smashed Darius's army at Issus, and captured the Persian royal family. He was no longer Philip's heir or Olympias's son. He was Alexander, the man the world was beginning to whisper might just be unstoppable. After Issus, Alexander had momentum. Persia had been humiliated, Darius was on the run, and the Levant, coastal city strung along the Mediterranean, lay open. But if you think Alexander simply marched eastward in a straight line, think again. He understood strategy as much as glory. To defeat Persia, he needed control of the sea. And to control the sea, he needed to take the ports. That's what brought him to Tyre and Gaza, 2 cities that seemed impossible to conquer. What followed were sieges that revealed not only Alexander's brilliance, but his ruthless, almost obsessive determination. Tyre wasn't just another city. It was a jewel of the Phoenician coast, a powerful naval base, and a fortress unlike any other. Built on an island half a mile offshore, Tyre was surrounded by thick walls rising straight out of the sea. Its navy was formidable, its people wealthy and proud, and its position made it nearly untouchable. For Alexander, leaving Tyre unconquered wasn't an option. As long as it held out, Persia had a base on the Mediterranean, a place from which fleets could strike his supply lines. He needed it. Here's the problem: how do you besiege a city in the middle of the sea if you don't have a navy? At first, it seemed like a standoff. Tyre mocked Alexander from its island walls, confident he couldn't touch them. But Alexander didn't accept impossible. He ordered his engineers to do something unthinkable: build a causeway, a massive stone and timber road stretching from the mainland out to the island. Day after day, his men piled rocks into the water, slowly pushing forward. Tyrians fired arrows, hurled rocks, and launched ships to burn the construction. Alexander countered with siege towers on the causeway, bristling with archers and catapults. It was a battle of persistence, stone by stone, fire against fire. Eventually, Alexander realized he couldn't do it alone. He called in fleets from conquered Phoenician cities, Sidon, Byblos, and others. One by one, their ships joined him, until he had a navy of over 200 vessels. Now he could blockade Tyre from the sea while continuing to build his causeway. The noose tightened. The Tyrians fought desperately, even ramming Macedonian ships with fireboats and killing captured sailors in brutal fashion. But Alexander would not relent. Finally, after 7 months, his causeway reached the walls. With his navy battering the city from the sea and siege engines hammering the defenses, Alexander launched a full assault. The Macedonians stormed the walls. The fighting was savage, house-to-house combat, blood in the streets, screams echoing off the stone. When it was over, Tyre was destroyed. Ancient sources say some 8,000 Tyrians were killed, 30,000 sold into slavery, and only a few spared. Alexander's wrath was terrifying. Tyre had defied him, and he made sure the world saw the price of defiance. The causeway he built still exists today, a permanent reminder of his will carved into the sea itself. After Tyre, Alexander turned south toward Egypt. But first, he encountered Gaza, another fortress that refused to open its gates. Built on high ground, with thick walls and strong defenders, Gaza was strategically vital. It controlled the road into Egypt. The siege lasted 2 months. Alexander's men battered the walls with catapults, filled trenches, and tried every angle of attack. The defenders fought ferociously, repelling wave after wave. But as at Tyre, persistence paid off. Finally, breaches were made, and Macedonian troops poured in. The fighting was brutal, and when Gaza fell, Alexander unleashed his fury again. The city's commander, Battus, was captured alive. Alexander, furious at Gaza's resistance, chose a cruel punishment. He had Battus dragged behind a chariot around the city walls, echoing Achilles' treatment of Hector in the Iliad. It was a chilling symbol. Alexander wasn't just imitating Achilles anymore. He was becoming him. Tyre and Gaza weren't just military victories. They were statements. Alexander was saying to the world, "No fortress is safe, no defiance will stand, no obstacle can stop me." Strategically, they secured his control of the Levant and the Mediterranean coast. Psychologically, they spread terror, ensuring many future cities surrendered rather than resist. Personally, they fed Alexander's self-image as a man destined to match and surpass the heroes of myth. With Tyre and Gaza crushed, the path to Egypt was open. For the first time in centuries, the Persian grip on the land of the Nile was broken. Alexander was about to enter a new world, a land of pyramids, pharaohs, and gods older than Greece itself. And there, his legend would grow even stranger. After the grinding sieges of Tyre and Gaza, Alexander turned his gaze to the land that had fascinated Greeks for centuries, Egypt. To the Macedonian king, Egypt wasn't just another satrapy of Persia. It was the ancient land of pyramids and gods, a place so steeped in legend that conquering it meant more than territory, it meant legitimacy, divinity, and the chance to link himself with the timeless mysteries of the Nile. When he marched in, though, something unexpected happened. There was no great battle, no desperate defense. Egypt, weary of Persian rule, opened its arms to him. The Egyptians had never warmed to their Persian overlords. They saw them as foreign conquerors who disrespected their traditions, plundered their temples, and ruled with a heavy hand. When Alexander arrived in 332 BCE, he played the role of liberator to perfection. He promised respect for Egyptian gods, visited their temples, and performed sacrifices according to their customs. Priests hailed him, crowds cheered him. In contrast to the bloody sieges he had just fought, his entry into Egypt was almost a celebration. It was as if the Nile itself accepted him. While in Egypt, Alexander founded what would become one of the most important cities in history, Alexandria. He personally marked out its site along the Mediterranean coast, envisioning it as a hub of trade, culture, and learning. At the time, it was just a plan scratched into the sand, but Alexander's instincts proved right. Alexandria would go on to become the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the great library, the lighthouse, and generations of philosophers and scientists. For Alexander, it was a way to leave a permanent stamp, a city carrying his name into eternity. But Alexander's greatest Egyptian moment didn't happen in a city. It happened in the desert. Driven by both curiosity and his hunger for divine validation, Alexander journeyed to the Siwa oasis, far into the Libyan desert, to consult the oracle of the god Ammon, whom the Greeks equated with Zeus. It was a grueling trek, with soldiers nearly dying of thirst, but Alexander was determined. When he finally reached the oasis, the priests welcomed him as more than a mortal. Ancient sources are frustratingly vague, but they agree on one thing: the oracle greeted Alexander as the son of Ammon. To his men, it might have sounded like flattery. To Alexander, it was destiny confirmed. From that moment on, he embraced the idea openly. He wasn't just a king. He was divine, or at least believed to be. In Memphis, Alexander was crowned pharaoh of Egypt, taking his place among a line of rulers stretching back thousands of years. He offered sacrifices to Apis, the sacred bull, and blended Macedonian pomp with Egyptian tradition. The symbolism mattered. In Greek lands, he was hegemon. In Persia, he was conqueror. In Egypt, he was pharaoh, a god-king. No conqueror before him had so seamlessly slipped into the identities of those he conquered. Alexander didn't just subdue, he became. Egypt gave Alexander several key things: legitimacy. By accepting him as pharaoh, the Egyptians granted him a divine role. Resources, the wealth of the Nile, its fertile lands, and its manpower were now his. Symbolism, by visiting Siwa and being declared the son of Ammon, Alexander elevated himself above mere mortals. It was a transformation. He entered Egypt a brilliant young general. He left as something more, a king convinced he was chosen by the gods. But Alexander didn't linger. Egypt was secure, the people loyal, the temples honored. His eyes turned once more to Persia. Darius had regrouped, gathering a massive army on the plains of Mesopotamia. The true test was still ahead, the battle that would decide the fate of empires. And Alexander, now carrying the title of pharaoh and the belief in his own divinity, was ready to meet it. By the autumn of 331 BCE, everything had led to this. Granicus proved Alexander could invade. Issus proved he could defeat Darius in the field. Tyre and Gaza showed that no fortress could withstand him. Egypt crowned him pharaoh and, in his mind at least, divine. Now came the ultimate test, the battle that would decide whether the Macedonian whirlwind would burn out or consume the Persian Empire entirely. That battle was fought on the plains near a small village called Gaugamela, and its outcome would tilt the axis of history. After his humiliation at Issus, Darius wasn't about to flee again without a fight. He assembled what was likely the largest army ever gathered under his command. Ancient sources inflate the numbers into the hundreds of thousands, some claim over 1 million, but modern historians suggest something closer to 100,000 to 250,000 Persians against Alexander's 47,000 Macedonians. Even with the lower estimate, the Persians massively outnumbered the Macedonians. And this time, Darius chose the ground carefully. He had his engineers flatten the plains near Gaugamela to create the perfect battlefield for his cavalry and his terrifying new weapons, scythed chariots, their wheels fitted with blades meant to mow down infantry like grass. It was meant to be Persia's redemption, the moment the great king erased the shame of Issus. Alexander didn't take the challenge lightly. His scouts brought word of the immense army waiting for him, and some of his generals urged a night attack. But Alexander refused. He wanted a decisive, open battle, one witnessed by all, where no one could say victory came from tricks or darkness. He would defeat Darius under the sun, with the world watching. It was audacious, but it was also classic Alexander. The night before the battle, Darius kept his army awake, expecting a sneak attack. Alexander, on the other hand, let his men sleep soundly. When asked why, he supposedly replied, "We are not stealing victory. We are winning it." On October 1, 331 BCE, the two armies faced each other. The Persians stretched wide across the plain, their numbers a daunting wall. Darius sat in a chariot at the center, surrounded by his guard. Alexander arrayed his men with discipline, the Macedonian phalanx in the center, light troops screening the front, and cavalry on the wings. He himself commanded the companion cavalry on the right. His plan was simple but brilliant: draw the Persian cavalry out of position, create a gap in the line, and drive straight at Darius. The Persians struck first. Scythed chariots thundered forward, blades spinning. But Alexander's troops, drilled to perfection, calmly opened ranks, letting the chariots pass before cutting down horses and drivers. The terror weapon fizzled. The Persian cavalry pressed hard on the Macedonian left, and for a moment it looked like they might overwhelm Parmenion, Alexander's senior general. But on the right, Alexander executed his plan. He advanced obliquely, drawing the Persian cavalry outward, stretching their line. And then, at the perfect moment, he wheeled inward, leading the companions in a thunderous charge directly into the gap that had opened in the Persian center. Straight at Darius. The scene echoed Issus, Alexander, spear leveled, cutting through guards, closing in on the great king. And once again, Darius lost his nerve. Facing the charge, he turned his chariot and fled. When the king fled, the Persian army's morale collapsed. But the scale of the battle meant chaos everywhere. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion was still hard-pressed, calling for help. Alexander, torn between pursuing Darius and supporting his general, chose to turn back and rescue his left wing. It meant Darius escaped again, fleeing east with a corps of his men. But the Persian army as a whole was shattered. Macedonian troops plundered the camp, capturing immense treasure and, once more, Darius's chariot and symbols of kingship. Gaugamela was decisive. The Persian military machine had been broken in open battle. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the jewels of the empire, would fall in quick succession. Darius still lived, still fled, still tried to rally forces. But the truth was clear: Persia was finished. The great king no longer commanded fear or loyalty. The world now looked to Alexander. Gaugamela wasn't just another battle. It was the hinge of empires. Strategically, it opened the heart of Persia to conquest. Psychologically, it proved beyond doubt that Alexander wasn't just lucky, he was unstoppable. Symbolically, it marked the passing of the torch from the ancient Persian world to a new Hellenistic age. In less than 3 years, Alexander had done what generations of Greeks had only dreamed of: he had destroyed the Persian war machine. Think about it. Barely in his mid-20s, Alexander had crossed into Asia with fewer than 40,000 men, faced armies several times his size, and broken them in open battle. At Gaugamela, the upstart Macedonian became, in truth, king of Asia. But conquest, as he would soon discover, wasn't just about winning battles. It was about ruling, and that would test him in ways no battlefield ever could. The dust of Gaugamela had barely settled when Alexander moved into the very heart of the Persian Empire. What followed wasn't just military conquest, it was triumph, spectacle, and a flood of unimaginable wealth. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, three of the greatest cities of the ancient world, fell into his hands like ripe fruit. And with them came the transition. Alexander the invader became Alexander the ruler. After Gaugamela, Alexander advanced into Mesopotamia. The Persian army was broken, Darius was in flight, and the empire's most prestigious city, Babylon, lay directly ahead. Babylon was no ordinary prize. It was the ancient jewel of Mesopotamia, with temples, palaces, and gardens that seemed to belong to myth as much as reality. Would it resist? Would Alexander have to fight again? The answer shocked even him. The gates opened. Babylon surrendered without resistance. Priests, nobles, and crowds poured out to welcome Alexander, hailing him not as a conqueror but as a king. The Babylonians had endured Persian rule for centuries, and Alexander's reputation for honoring local traditions worked in his favor. He entered the city in triumph, sacrificing at the temples of Babylonian gods like Marduk, showing himself as a respectful ruler rather than a foreign overlord. It was brilliant politics, and it set the tone for what was to come. Next came Susa, one of Persia's capitals and the site of its immense royal treasury. Here, Alexander struck gold, literally. The city, like Babylon, surrendered. And in its treasuries, Alexander found an astronomical sum. Ancient sources speak of 50,000 talents of silver, billions in today's terms. The wealth was so vast it boggles the imagination. Suddenly, Alexander wasn't just commanding an army, he was commanding the economic might of Persia itself. With this treasure, he could fund his conquests indefinitely, reward his men, and tighten his grip on both loyalty and ambition. For a king always hungry for expansion, it was fuel poured onto the fire. But it was Persepolis that loomed largest, not just as a city, but as a symbol. This was the ceremonial capital of Persia, the showcase of its power and culture. Its palaces were works of art, its halls supported by towering columns, its reliefs depicting tribute from across the vast empire. To conquer Persepolis was to put Persia itself under his heel. The march wasn't easy. The route through the Zagros Mountains was harsh, and the Persian commander Ariobarzanes tried to block Alexander at the Persian gates, a narrow pass. For a moment, it looked like the Macedonian advance might stall. But Alexander, using scouts and local guides, found a path around the Persian position and crushed the defenders in a brutal pincer. The gates were forced open, and the road to Persepolis lay clear. When he entered the city in early 330 BCE, it was both awe-inspiring and bitter. To the Persians, this was their sacred center. To Alexander's Greeks, it was the heart of the enemy they had fought for generations. And then came one of the most controversial acts of Alexander's career. At first, he treated Persepolis with respect, taking control of the treasury, an even greater hoard than Susa's, and occupying the palaces. But during a drunken celebration, fueled by wine and perhaps by revenge, Alexander ordered the royal palace complex set on fire. Some say it was deliberate, a symbolic act of vengeance for the Persian burning of Athens in 480 BCE. Others say it was spontaneous, egged on by companions and courtesans. Either way, the flames consumed one of the greatest architectural marvels of the ancient world. Alexander reportedly regretted it afterward, walking through the charred ruins with a heavy heart. But the act had already stamped its message: Persia's glory was ashes, and Alexander was the new master. By the time Persepolis fell, Alexander had done the unthinkable. He had shattered the Persian military, captured its greatest cities, and seized its wealth. He now controlled the empire of Darius, in name if not yet in fact. But conquest raises new questions. Would Alexander remain a Greek liberator? Or would he transform into a Persian king? The answer was beginning to take shape in Babylon and Susa, where he adopted elements of Persian dress and ceremony. His men grumbled. Alexander wasn't just conquering Persia, he was becoming it. Darius was still alive, still fleeing eastward, still trying to rally support. Alexander's victories were dazzling, but unfinished. To truly claim Persia, he would need to capture or kill the great king. The chase was about to begin, a pursuit that would take him across deserts and mountains, into the very edges of the known world. By the time Persepolis lay in ashes, Alexander had already achieved what no Greek had even dreamed possible. He stood at the head of the Persian Empire's crown jewels. Yet one thing eluded him: Darius III still lived. For Alexander, that was unacceptable. A conqueror without the great king in chains, or dead, was a conqueror with unfinished business. And so began a relentless pursuit across Persia's eastern provinces, a chase that turned into a drama of betrayal and vengeance. After Gaugamela, Darius fled eastward, abandoning Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis to Alexander. But don't mistake him for a coward skulking alone. He still commanded loyalty in the empire's far reaches, Bactria, Sogdiana, and the lands that would later become parts of Afghanistan and Central Asia. Satraps and noble families sheltered him, hoping he could raise new armies from the east. Darius was no fool. He knew Alexander was fast and ruthless, so his strategy was to retreat into the vastness of his empire, stretching Alexander's lines until the Macedonian machine collapsed under its own weight. It was a gamble on geography and endurance. Alexander, however, thrived on speed. He didn't pause to consolidate or rest on his laurels. His army, though weary, followed him with a mix of fear, loyalty, and hunger for plunder. Through the Zagros Mountains, across burning deserts and freezing passes, they marched. When resistance flared, tribes that thought themselves safe in remote strongholds, Alexander crushed them with lightning strikes. He couldn't allow pockets of defiance. His pursuit of Darius doubled as a brutal campaign of terror to keep Persia subdued. At every turn, the gap closed. Darius's circle shrank, his followers wary, his allies doubtful. The chase wasn't just military, it was psychological. By the summer of 330 BCE, Darius's own nobles began to lose faith. Chief among them was Bessus, the satrap of Bactria. Ambitious, pragmatic, and ruthless, Bessus decided the great king had become more liability than leader. As Alexander closed in, Bessus and a group of conspirators seized Darius. At first, they pretended it was to protect him, but soon their true motives emerged. They plotted to kill Darius and proclaim Bessus himself as king. When Alexander's forces were just days behind, the conspirators struck. They stabbed Darius and left him dying in a wagon, abandoned in the dust of his own empire. When Alexander reached the site, he found Darius still alive, barely. Ancient accounts say Alexander cradled him, offering comfort in his final moments. Darius supposedly thanked him for his respect toward his family and asked him to avenge his death. Whether these words were spoken or imagined, the symbolism was powerful. Alexander ordered Darius's body sent to Persepolis with full royal honors. To Persians, this was stunning. The Macedonian conqueror was treating their fallen king as if he were his own predecessor. But vengeance was not just ceremonial. Bessus declared himself Artaxerxes V, king of Persia, in Bactria. For Alexander, this was intolerable. It wasn't just a matter of revenge, it was legitimacy. If Bessus claimed the Persian crown, Alexander's authority as king of Asia was in question. The pursuit began anew, this time into the wilds of Central Asia. Bessus, however, lacked Darius's stature. His betrayal disgusted many Persians, and one by one his supporters wavered. Eventually, his own men betrayed him to Alexander. The punishment was brutal. Bessus was mutilated, his nose and ears cut off, a Persian form of disgrace, then executed. Alexander wanted the world to see, betrayal was worse than defeat. With Darius dead, something profound changed. Alexander was no longer just the destroyer of Persia, he became its heir. He began to wear Persian royal dress, adopt Persian court rituals, and present himself not as a Greek conqueror ruling foreigners but as the legitimate king of kings. This unsettled his Macedonian troops, who grumbled at seeing their king in Persian robes, but Alexander knew what he was doing. To hold an empire this vast, he couldn't be just Macedonian. He had to be Persian too. The chase and death of Darius closed one chapter and opened another. For Persia, it marked the true end of the Achaemenid dynasty. Their king had died not in battle against foreigners but at the hands of traitors. For Alexander, it was a chance to step into Darius's shoes, not just as conqueror but as successor. For history, it was the moment the Macedonian king became something larger, the ruler of two worlds, Greek and Persian. Alexander had won the empire. But as he pushed further east into Bactria and Sogdiana, he discovered that winning an empire was one thing, holding it was another. Rebellions flared, loyalty wavered, and the young king's paranoia deepened. The war wasn't over. In some ways, it was just beginning. With Darius dead and Bessus punished, Alexander might have seemed to stand at the height of his power. He was now, in name and in practice, the king of kings, the heir to the Persian throne. The great capitals of the empire were his, the treasuries overflowing, the armies defeated. By all accounts, he could have stopped. He could have declared victory, returned to Greece in glory, and secured his name in history as the man who toppled Persia. But Alexander wasn't wired to stop. Instead, he turned his gaze east, into the rugged, rebellious provinces of Bactria and Sogdiana, the regions that stretch into modern Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. It was here, not in Babylon or Persepolis, that Alexander faced some of his greatest challenges, not in grand battles, but in endless, grinding resistance. Bactria and Sogdiana were not like the soft lands of Mesopotamia or the rich valleys of Egypt. These were rugged territories, marked by mountains, deserts, and fiercely independent tribes. Control of the land was loose even under Persian kings. Satraps ruled with difficulty, and loyalty was paper-thin. When Alexander arrived, he wasn't greeted as a liberator or a king. He was seen as yet another foreign invader. And unlike in Babylon or Egypt, the people here were not so easily cowed. What Alexander faced in Bactria and Sogdiana was not conventional warfare. There were no massive armies lining up on open plains. Instead, he encountered hit-and-run raids, ambushes in mountain passes, and sudden uprisings. His disciplined phalanx, so deadly on flat terrain, often struggled in the rough landscapes. But Alexander adapted. He split his forces, hunted rebels through valleys and gorges, and built fortified settlements to pin down the land. He became as much a counterinsurgency leader as a conqueror. Victory was not measured in one decisive clash but in 1,000 small skirmishes. Though Bessus had been executed, his allies and sympathizers weren't finished. Leaders like Spitamenes, a Sogdian noble, rallied resistance. Spitamenes proved particularly dangerous, striking at Alexander's supply lines, ambushing detachments, and even defeating Macedonian forces when Alexander wasn't present. The war dragged on for years. Alexander's army, already weary from the long campaigns, began to grumble. They had marched from Greece to the edge of the known world. When would it end? Yet Alexander pressed on, chasing enemies deeper into the wilderness, refusing to accept anything less than total control. One of Alexander's strategies for controlling the East was the founding of new cities, Alexandrias, planted like military colonies across the region. Each served as a fortress, a supply hub, and a symbol of his power. These settlements were staffed with soldiers, settlers, and sometimes even locals. It was clever, but it also showed Alexander's long-term vision. He wasn't just passing through. He intended to hold these lands, to weave them into his empire permanently. The name Alexandria, stamped across Central Asia, was as much a declaration of will as the Sarissa on the battlefield. It was in Bactria that Alexander's personal life took a dramatic turn. To cement his rule, he married Roxana, the daughter of a local noble. By all accounts, she was strikingly beautiful, and some sources even suggest Alexander fell for her genuinely. But make no mistake, this was also politics. By marrying into the local elite, Alexander hoped to win the loyalty of Bactrian nobles and show himself not as a conqueror from afar, but as a king tied to their bloodlines. The marriage sent ripples through his Macedonian ranks. Many of his men disliked the idea of their king marrying a barbarian. But Alexander didn't care. He was already moving toward a vision where Greek and Persian, and now Central Asian, identities blended together under his rule. But the longer the war dragged on, the darker Alexander became. The endless guerrilla resistance frustrated him. Betrayals gnawed at his trust. His insistence on being treated not just as king but as something more, almost divine, put him at odds with his officers. It was during these years that cracks began to show. Executions for treason became more frequent. Suspicion of plots and conspiracies hung in the air. Alexander's temper, once fiery but controlled, flared dangerously. He demanded Persian-style proskynesis, ritual obeisance that Greeks saw as servile, and this widened the gulf between him and his Macedonian companions. The East wasn't breaking Alexander militarily, it was reshaping him psychologically. By 327 BCE, Alexander had subdued Bactria and Sogdiana, though never completely. Rebellion simmered beneath the surface, and it was only his relentless pressure that kept them down. Still, he had achieved enough to move further east. But the cost was heavy. His army was stretched thin, his officers uneasy, and his own image shifting from brilliant general to godlike autocrat. The Alexander who left Greece had been ambitious, hungry, even charming. The Alexander emerging from the eastern campaigns was harder, more suspicious, and more convinced than ever of his divine destiny. Why did he push so far? For Alexander, conquest was not about borders, it was about momentum. Stopping meant decline, meant admitting that his destiny had limits. And so he pressed onward, beyond the boundaries of Persia, into lands no Greek had ever seen, toward India, where elephants waited and his army's patience would finally crack. By the late 320s BCE, Alexander was no longer just a conqueror marching through Persia, he was a ruler trying to hold together an empire stitched from countless peoples, languages, and traditions. That meant politics as much as battles, marriages as much as massacres. And in the harsh, restless lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander used both. The story of his new queen, Roxana, is inseparable from the rebellions that tested his grip on the east. Some sources claim it was love at first sight. During a banquet hosted by a local noble, Alexander reportedly saw Roxana dancing and was captivated by her beauty. Others suggest it was pure politics. Roxana was the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman, Oxyartes, and marrying her would bind Alexander to the local aristocracy. Either way, the marriage in 327 BCE was unusual for a Macedonian king. Traditionally, Macedonian kings married noblewomen from their own clans or allied Greek families. Roxana was neither. To Alexander's men, she was a barbarian bride. To Alexander, she was a bridge, a way to cement his claim not just as conqueror, but as rightful ruler of the East. The wedding, conducted in Bactrian style, was both scandal and symbol. Alexander's companions grumbled. Olympias, his mother back in Macedon, was furious at being replaced in influence by a foreign girl. But Alexander had made his choice. Roxana became his queen. Marriage alone didn't pacify the East. The lands of Sogdiana and Bactria were a patchwork of mountain fortresses and fiercely independent tribes. Alexander's presence sparked resistance almost everywhere. One of his most dangerous opponents was Spidomenes, a Sogdian noble who waged a relentless guerrilla campaign. He struck supply lines, ambushed Macedonian detachments, and rallied locals to his cause. At one point, his forces annihilated a large Macedonian garrison, sending shockwaves through Alexander's army. Alexander responded with his usual blend of speed and ruthlessness. He pursued rebels into mountain fastnesses, built new fortresses to secure his hold, and unleashed terrifying reprisals on towns that resisted. It was during these campaigns that Alexander faced some of the most legendary sieges of his career, not against great cities, but against mountain strongholds known as the Sogdian Rock and the Rock of Koreans. These fortresses, perched high on cliffs, were believed to be impregnable. When Alexander demanded surrender, the defenders mocked him, saying he would need men with wings to take their citadel. So Alexander found his wings. He ordered a group of volunteers to climb the cliffs at night with ropes and tent pegs. Dozens fell to their deaths, but by morning, a band of Macedonians appeared on the heights above the fortress. When the defenders looked up and saw men with wings standing where no army should be, they surrendered in shock. The episode was pure Alexander, daring, symbolic, and devastatingly effective. Even with these victories, the rebellions were not easy to crush. It took years of grinding campaigns to wear down resistance. Villages were burned, populations scattered, and local leaders executed. Spitamenes, once the symbol of resistance, was eventually betrayed and killed by his own allies, who sent his severed head to Alexander. The message was clear: opposition to Alexander was suicidal. But rebellion didn't just come from the locals. Within Alexander's own ranks, tensions boiled. His adoption of Persian customs, wearing their robes, demanding rituals of obeisance, marrying Roxana, angered his Macedonian officers. They had followed him across half the world, but many still saw themselves as free Greeks and Macedonians, not subjects of a new Eastern empire. The cracks began to widen. Whispers of discontent spread through the camp. Alexander's temper grew sharper, his paranoia more dangerous. The East had tested his army physically. Now it was testing its unity. Roxana, caught in the middle, became both symbol and lightning rod. To some, she was the embodiment of Alexander's vision, a blending of Greek and Persian worlds, a union that showed he wasn't just a foreign conqueror but a legitimate heir to Persia's legacy. To others, she was proof that Alexander had abandoned his roots, seduced by barbarian ways. For Alexander, though, Roxana was more than politics. She traveled with him on campaign, shared his bed, and, according to some accounts, softened his harder edges in private moments. She represented both love and blood, love as his chosen queen, blood as the price of the rebellions that surrounded her. By 326 BCE, Alexander had crushed resistance in Bactria and Sogdiana, secured his hold with fortresses and garrisons, and sealed his legitimacy with marriage. But the experience had changed him. He was no longer just the golden-haired conqueror of Issus and Gaugamela. He was harder now, less patient, more ruthless. He had learned to fight not just battles, but endless, grinding wars of attrition. And he had learned that trust was dangerous, that betrayal could come not only from Persians but from his own men. The cracks in his army's loyalty would soon split wide. And when Alexander turned his gaze further east, toward India, those cracks would nearly break him. By the spring of 327 BCE, Alexander had achieved what no Macedonian, or Greek, had ever dared dream. The Persian Empire was broken. Darius was dead. The treasuries of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis had poured their wealth into his hands. He was, by all rights, the most powerful man on earth. But for Alexander, Persia wasn't the finish line. It was just another stepping stone. His eyes were fixed further east, on the lands whispered about in Greek lore, India, a place of endless rivers, strange beasts, and fabulous wealth. Where others saw the edge of the known world, Alexander saw the next stage of his destiny. To reach India, Alexander first had to cross the Hindu Kush, one of the most formidable mountain ranges on earth. Its peaks towered above the clouds, its passes treacherous with ice and snow. For an army hardened by years of desert marches and mountain fighting, even this was a new ordeal. The Macedonians weren't prepared for the cold. Men froze in their sleep, supplies dwindled, and horses collapsed on the icy paths. Some soldiers hacked at the frozen ground just to make fire pits. Others slipped off cliffs, vanishing into chasms. But Alexander pushed them forward, as relentless as the mountains themselves. He rode at the front, sharing the same hardships, refusing to be seen as softer than his men. It was miserable, deadly, but they made it through. And on the other side lay the Punjab, a land as different from Persia as night from day. The lands west of the Indus River weren't united under one great empire like Persia. Instead, they were a patchwork of tribes and small kingdoms, some hostile, some ready to ally. At first, Alexander's arrival sparked resistance. Fortresses resisted, hill tribes fought back, and the Macedonians found themselves in brutal, small-scale battles against enemies who knew the terrain far better. The Aspagioi and Assakinoi tribes in particular gave fierce resistance, forcing Alexander into long sieges. One fortress, at Massaga, took days of bloody assault to fall. Alexander himself was wounded by an arrow through the leg during these fights, a reminder that even after years of victory, death was never far away. Yet one by one, the strongholds were taken, their defenders slaughtered or enslaved, their leaders executed. Alexander's reputation for ruthlessness only grew. India stunned the Macedonians. The climate was hotter, the rivers broader, the animals stranger. They saw elephants for the first time, massive, armored beasts used in war, towering over men and horses. To many Greeks, they looked like monsters from myth. The culture too was alien, new gods, new languages, new customs. Alexander, as always, was curious. He questioned local priests and philosophers, probing for wisdom, comparing their ideas to Aristotle's teachings. But he was also impatient. India was not just to be studied. It was to be conquered. What drove Alexander onward? Some say it was simple greed for plunder. Others argue it was the pull of myth. India was the land of Dionysus, who according to legend had marched east and returned in triumph. Alexander, ever eager to outdo heroes both real and mythical, wanted to surpass Dionysus himself. But deeper still was his obsession with never stopping. For Alexander, to pause was to admit limits. And limits had no place in the mind of a man who believed himself son of Zeus Ammon. So even as his men muttered, exhausted from years of campaigning, Alexander urged them forward, over rivers, against new enemies, into lands none of them had ever imagined. But India wasn't Persia. There was no single great king to topple, no single battle to decide everything. Each city, each tribe was another fight, another drain on Macedonian strength. And as the army pressed further east, the murmurings grew louder. They had followed Alexander for nearly a decade, across deserts, mountains, and rivers. They had fought and bled, and still there was no end in sight. Unrest was growing. And soon, it would boil over. Still, for the moment, the army marched on. Ahead lay one of Alexander's greatest battles, against a king who would test him like no Persian ever had, Porus, lord of the Punjab, who brought elephants to war and refused to bow to Macedon. The showdown at the Hydaspes River would be brutal, strange, and unforgettable. And it would mark the furthest reach of Alexander's unstoppable ambition. By 326 BCE, Alexander had carved his way into the Punjab. But now he faced an enemy unlike any he had met before. Not a satrap scrambling to hold the line, nor a fortress tucked in the mountains. This was a king, powerful, proud, and unwilling to submit. His name was Porus, and he ruled a kingdom on the banks of the Hydaspes River, modern Jhelum, in Pakistan. Porus was no petty chieftain. He commanded seasoned warriors, skilled cavalry, and, most terrifying to the Macedonians, war elephants, massive beasts armored for battle, towering over men and horses. For Alexander's army, it was like facing living siege towers. What unfolded on the muddy banks of the Hydaspes was one of the strangest and most brutal battles of Alexander's career, rain-slicked, bloody, and unforgettable. When Alexander reached the Hydaspes, swollen by monsoon rains, Porus was waiting on the far bank with his army. His elephants stood in a line, their trumpeting filling the air, while his cavalry and infantry formed a wall of spears. Crossing a river under those conditions seemed suicidal. The Macedonians knew it. Alexander's generals urged caution. But Alexander wasn't one to retreat, or to charge head-on into disaster. He would outthink his enemy. Alexander camped opposite Porus, making a great show of preparing crossings, marching his cavalry up and down the river each day. Porus shadowed him, moving his elephants along the bank to block every potential ford. Then, one stormy night, Alexander vanished from camp with a picked force, cavalry, light infantry, and some of his phalanx. He marched upriver under cover of thunder and rain. At a wooded bend of the river, hidden from Porus, he crossed in boats and makeshift rafts. By dawn, he was on the far bank, soaked but ready. Porus, realizing too late what had happened, scrambled to meet him. The stage was set. Porus advanced with around 30,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, 200 elephants, and 300 chariots. Alexander had perhaps 23,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry with him. It was evenly matched, but the elephants were an unknown terror. The clash opened with cavalry. Alexander's horsemen struck Porus's left flank, while his other commanders pressed on the right. The fighting was chaotic, horses rearing at the sight and smell of elephants, men cut down by giant tusks and trampling feet. In the center, Porus unleashed his elephants against the Macedonian phalanx. The sarissas, so deadly against men and horses, wavered against beasts armored in hide and iron. Elephants crashed into the lines, tossing soldiers aside, goring them, crushing entire ranks beneath their weight. The phalanx bent, staggered, but did not break. Alexander adapted quickly. He ordered his archers and javelin throwers to target the elephants' mahouts, drivers, and vulnerable spots. As elephants went berserk, trampling friend and foe alike, gaps opened in Porus's line. Meanwhile, Alexander's cavalry hammered the flanks, encircling Porus's horsemen and driving them from the field. Slowly, methodically, the Macedonians tightened their grip. The elephants, magnificent but unwieldy, became a liability. Surrounded and harried, many panicked. Some turned back into Porus's own infantry, trampling them in confusion. The tide shifted. Even as his army crumbled, Porus himself fought on. Mounted on an elephant, towering above the battlefield, he hurled javelins and commanded his men with unwavering courage. He was massive, said to be over 6 feet tall, a giant to the Greeks. When finally surrounded and wounded, Porus refused to surrender until he was assured he would be treated as a king, not a prisoner. When Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, Porus famously replied, "Like a king." Alexander, ever drawn to boldness, was impressed. Rather than humiliate him, he honored him. He allowed Porus to keep his throne and even granted him more territory. In Porus, Alexander recognized a mirror of his own pride and defiance. The battle was a Macedonian victory, but a costly one. Thousands lay dead, Macedonian and Indian alike. The sight of elephants rampaging through phalanxes haunted survivors. But strategically, the victory opened the Punjab to Alexander's control. More importantly, it added to his legend. He had faced not just kings but war elephants, beasts out of myth, and prevailed. His men admired him, but they also feared him more than ever. Hydaspes was not just another victory. It revealed key truths about Alexander: adaptability. He turned an alien weapon, the elephant, into a liability for its owners. Respect for worthy foes. His treatment of Porus showed magnanimity, not just cruelty. Unstoppable ambition. Even after years of conquest, he still pressed forward, as if the world itself had no edge. But for his men, Hydaspes was a turning point of another kind. They had marched for nearly a decade, through deserts and mountains, across empires and rivers. Now, with India stretching endlessly before them, they began to wonder, when does it end? The answer, at least for them, would come at the Hyphasis River, where even Alexander's iron will met its first true refusal. The Hydaspes had been a victory, costly, bloody, and unforgettable. Alexander had faced elephants, stormed through monsoon rains, and humbled a king who fought like a titan. But after years of relentless campaigning, his army had reached its breaking point. It wasn't a Persian satrap or an Indian warlord who stopped Alexander's advance, it was his own men. The confrontation came not in battle, but on the banks of the Hyphasis River, modern Beos, the furthest eastern reach of Alexander's campaign. Here, in 326 BCE, his army finally said, "No more." By this time, the Macedonians had been marching for nearly a decade. They had left their homes in Greece and Macedon behind, crossed Asia Minor, shattered Persia, trudged through deserts, mountains, and monsoon rains, and fought endless battles. Now, looking east from the Hyphasis, they saw only more rivers, more jungles, more kingdoms. Scouts brought reports of even greater armies beyond, armies with thousands of elephants. To the weary soldiers, it sounded less like glory and more like suicide. They had given everything. And for the first time, they refused to give more. When word spread that the men would not march further, Alexander was livid. He called assemblies, pleading with them, reminding them of their victories, of the wealth they had gained, of the immortality of their names. He promised more riches, more lands, more glory. He painted a picture of the edge of the world, just beyond their reach, waiting for them to seize it. He even invoked the gods, claiming destiny demanded they go further. But the soldiers were unmoved. They had fought rivers, deserts, and kings. They had lost friends, brothers, sons. They had marched further than any Greek had ever imagined. Enough was enough. According to the ancient sources, when Alexander finished one of his fiery speeches demanding they follow him, the army responded not with cheers or shouts, but with silence. An entire army, tens of thousands of men, simply stood in silence. That silence was deafening. It wasn't rebellion, but it was unshakable. The army had made its decision. For days, Alexander sulked in his tent, refusing to speak with anyone, hoping his silence would guilt the men into relenting. It didn't work. His officers, men like Cenas, spoke plainly, the men could march no further. Even the greatest king could not drag his army beyond its will. Finally, Alexander relented. With bitterness in his heart, he ordered altars built on the banks of the Hyphasis, dedicating them to the gods as a marker of how far they had come. He framed it not as defeat but as the natural limit of their world-conquering mission. The men would go no further, but their achievement would stand forever. With that, Alexander turned his army back. But even in retreat, he chose not the easy road. Instead of marching safely back the way they had come, he decided to lead his men southward, through new lands and across new rivers. If he couldn't go forward, he would still carve new territory on the way home. The decision would lead them into unimaginable hardship, the descent through the Punjab, the brutal march across the Gadrosian desert, and losses that dwarfed even their bloodiest battles. The standoff at the Hyphasis was a rare moment in Alexander's career where his unstoppable will met an immovable wall. For his men, it was proof they still had a voice, even in the shadow of a man who believed himself divine. For Alexander, it was the first taste of limitation, a moment that gnawed at him for the rest of his life. He would never accept it as defeat, but he would never forget it either. For history, it marked the eastern edge of his empire. His conquest stretched from Greece to India, but no further. Standing on the banks of the Hyphasis, staring into the east, Alexander must have felt the sting of frustration. In his mind, he had been destined to conquer the whole world. But even destiny could not move an exhausted army. For the first time, Alexander bowed, not to an enemy, not to a king, but to the will of his own men. When Alexander finally agreed to turn back at the Hyphasis in 326 BCE, it wasn't the end of hardship, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The march back west, through India and then across the arid wastes of modern-day Pakistan and Iran, became one of the most grueling chapters of his career. Victories had defined Alexander's advance. Suffering defined his return. Instead of retracing their steps the way they had come, Alexander made a fateful choice. Rather than march straight back through the Hindu Kush into safer territory, he decided to explore and conquer the Indus Valley. His reasoning was part strategy, part curiosity. He wanted to secure the region, open routes for trade, and map lands barely known to the Greeks. So the army built a fleet. As some soldiers marched along the banks, Alexander led ships down the mighty Indus River. It was an extraordinary sight, Macedonian warships navigating a river that, to them, seemed endless, with jungles and strange tribes pressing close on either side. But it wasn't peaceful. Every tribe and town along the Indus had to be subdued, and many resisted. Some battles were fierce, others devastating for the locals. The march down the Indus was a conquest in miniature, with Alexander fighting as hard on the way home as he had on the way east. One encounter nearly ended everything. When the Malyans, a fierce tribe of the Punjab, resisted, Alexander stormed their fortress. In the heat of battle, he scaled the walls himself, too far ahead of his men. An arrow struck him in the chest, deep enough to pierce his lung. He collapsed, bleeding heavily. Word spread like wildfire, the king is dead. Panic rippled through the ranks. But Alexander wasn't dead, not yet. His companions pulled him from the field, and though his survival was uncertain for days, he eventually recovered. When he reappeared, weak but alive, his men wept and cheered. The episode was a reminder, the empire lived or died with one man. By 325 BCE, the Macedonians reached the mouth of the Indus and the Arabian Sea. Here Alexander unveiled another ambitious plan. The fleet, commanded by Nearchus, would sail west along the coast to explore and supply the march. Meanwhile, Alexander himself would lead the bulk of the army through Gidroja, a desert region in southern Iran. Why this route? Some say he wanted to emulate, and surpass, the mythical march of Semiramis or Cyrus, who had both lost armies in Gidroja. Others argue he simply underestimated the terrain. Whatever the reason, it would prove catastrophic. The Gidrojan desert, modern Makran, was a wasteland of burning heat, shifting sand, and scarce water. The decision to march through it nearly destroyed Alexander's army. The soldiers suffered endlessly. Wells were dry, food ran out, and the heat was unbearable. Men collapsed and died by the roadside, pack animals perished in droves. Some units resorted to slaughtering camels for water, drinking the liquid from their stomachs. One famous story tells of soldiers finding a small helmet filled with water and offering it to Alexander. He poured it out onto the sand in front of them, declaring he would share their thirst. It was a gesture that inspired loyalty, but it didn't quench their agony. By the time they staggered out of the desert, tens of thousands had died. The desert claimed more lives than any battle. Meanwhile, Nearchus and the fleet also endured horrors. Storms, hunger, and shipwrecks plagued the sailors as they hugged the unfamiliar coastline. But against all odds, they survived, mapping lands that no Greek had charted before. When Alexander rejoined them, battered but alive, the combined ordeal became part of his legend. Few could boast of surviving what they had. When Alexander finally led his army back into Persia proper, the survivors were gaunt, scarred, and exhausted. They had left Greece years before as eager adventurers. Now they returned as shadows of themselves, hardened by battles, deserts, and rivers, their faith in their king tested beyond measure. For Alexander, the return wasn't a retreat. In his eyes, it was another conquest, another epic added to his legend. But for his men, it was something else, proof that glory came at a terrible price. This brutal return revealed both sides of Alexander at once: his ambition, choosing a path through hell itself just to prove it could be done; his resilience, surviving wounds, hunger, and terrain that should have killed him; his ruthlessness, pushing his men past the limits of human endurance. It was victory by survival, conquest by endurance. The desert didn't make him greater, it made him mortal in the eyes of his men, even as it etched his myth deeper into history. By the end of 325 BCE, Alexander was back in Persian territory. But he wasn't the same golden-haired conqueror who had left Greece. He was harder, harsher, more convinced of his divine calling, and increasingly suspicious of those around him. The empire stretched from the Aegean to India. But holding it would prove more dangerous than winning it. By 324 BCE, Alexander had returned from the farthest reaches of the world. He had crossed deserts, survived wounds that nearly killed him, faced elephants, and marched his men farther than any army had ever gone. Now he returned to Babylon, the city he had once entered as a conqueror, but this time not just as a victor. He returned as the master of an empire that stretched from Greece to India. Yet even in triumph, shadows loomed. Babylon would be the stage for both his boldest ambitions and the first hints of his downfall. The empire Alexander came back to wasn't the same as the one he had left behind. Years of campaigning had drained manpower and stirred resentment. Rebellion simmered in the provinces. Satraps and generals had grown bold in his absence, ruling like kings themselves. Alexander cracked down ruthlessly. Those governors who had misruled or enriched themselves were executed. Others were replaced with men loyal only to him. He was no longer content to be just the head of Macedon or Greece, he ruled as a Persian great king, a pharaoh, a lord of Asia. Alexander's return to Babylon also revealed his grand experiment, the fusion of East and West into a single ruling elite. He wasn't satisfied with ruling Persians as a foreign conqueror. He wanted to blend Greeks and Persians together into one empire. He encouraged intermarriage between his officers and Persian nobility. Most famously, at Susa in 324 BCE, he staged a mass wedding of Macedonian officers to Persian women, dozens of unions sealed in one grand ceremony. Alexander himself had already married Roxana, but he added 2 Persian princesses to his household as well, further cementing ties. Not everyone was pleased. His Macedonian soldiers grumbled at these barbarian unions, seeing their king drifting from his roots. But Alexander pressed forward. He wasn't building a Greek empire, he was building something entirely new. The tension boiled over at Opis, on the Tigris River. When Alexander announced he would be sending home veterans and replacing them with Persian recruits, his Macedonian troops revolted. They shouted that he had betrayed them, favoring foreigners over the men who had marched with him for a decade. Alexander's response was furious. He arrested ringleaders, executed them, and gave a blistering speech, reminding the Macedonians that without him they would be nothing. Then, in a dramatic move, he dismissed his entire army, declaring he no longer needed them. The soldiers, stunned, broke down in tears and begged forgiveness. Alexander relented, reasserting his authority. But the incident revealed a dangerous truth: the loyalty of his men, once absolute, was fraying. Perhaps the deepest wound of all came not from rebellion but from loss. In 324 BCE, Alexander's closest companion, Hephaestion, fell ill and died suddenly at Ecbatana. Hephaestion wasn't just a general. He was Alexander's confidant, his friend since boyhood, the one man who could speak freely to him. His death devastated Alexander. He wept uncontrollably, refused food, and cut his hair in mourning, echoing Achilles grieving for Patroclus. He even executed the doctor who had failed to save him. Alexander declared Hephaestion a demigod, sending envoys to consult oracles for divine recognition. Monuments rose in his honor, and plans were made for massive ceremonies. The death of Hephaestion broke something inside Alexander, it left him more isolated than ever. Despite grief and unrest, Alexander pressed on. He envisioned Babylon as the new capital of his world empire, a crossroads of east and west, perfectly placed to govern land stretching across continents. He began massive building projects, canals, and plans for new expeditions. And his ambitions hadn't cooled. He was already dreaming of fresh conquests, Arabia, and beyond that perhaps Carthage, Italy, even the Atlantic. To Alexander, the world still seemed unfinished, its map incomplete without his hand upon it. Yet even as he planned, ominous signs haunted him. Babylon's priests warned him not to enter the city, claiming their omens predicted danger. Alexander laughed them off, or pretended to. But his men noticed how often he sought prophecies, sacrifices, and oracles. The invincible king seemed more fearful of fate than before. He was only 32, but years of wounds, fevers, and endless campaigns had taken their toll. He was tired, his body battered, his heart heavy with loss. And yet his ambition never wavered. When Alexander returned to Babylon, he was at once the most powerful man on earth and a man teetering on the edge. He had wealth, armies, and empires at his feet. He had visions of worlds still unconquered. But he also had enemies, plots, and the weariness of a decade of war pressing down on him. In Babylon, Alexander stood at the height of his glory. But Babylon would also be the place where that glory began to crumble. In June of 323 BCE, Babylon was alive with energy. Alexander was back, the empire was secure, and plans for new conquests were already on the table. Arabia was to be next, its deserts, trade routes, and rich incense cities added to his growing dominion. Ships were being built, armies prepared. On paper, nothing could stop him. And yet, within weeks, the man who had never lost a battle, who had marched from Greece to India, who had stared down kings and crushed empires, was gone. His death at just 32 remains one of history's great mysteries, a mix of fever, suspicion, and myth. It began innocuously. After a banquet, some say at the house of Medius, one of his companions, Alexander drank heavily, as was his custom. Accounts differ on what followed. Some say he cried out suddenly in pain after drinking a great cup of unmixed wine. Others report that he simply fell ill with fever the next day. For days, the fever worsened. He continued to direct affairs, even giving instructions for military plans, but his condition deteriorated rapidly. He lost his strength, struggled to speak, and was carried from place to place. His generals and soldiers watched helplessly as the man who had seemed unstoppable dwindled before their eyes. As the fever raged, the Macedonian army grew restless. Rumors flew: was their king poisoned? Was this a plot? Would he recover? Finally, when it was clear Alexander was near death, the soldiers demanded to see him. According to the stories, thousands filed past his bed in silence. He could no longer speak, but he raised his hand or nodded faintly, acknowledging each man. It was a haunting scene, the army that had carried him across the world now bearing witness to his final moments. How did Alexander die? Ancient writers offer theories, and debate continues even today. Poison. Some claimed he was poisoned, perhaps by rivals fearful of his growing Persianization, or by generals wary of his next campaigns. But most historians doubt this. His illness lasted too long for typical ancient poisons. Malaria or typhoid. Others suggest he contracted a disease in Babylon's swampy environment. Fever, weakness, and delirium fit the symptoms. Autoimmune or other illness. Some modern doctors speculate on conditions like Guillain-Barré syndrome, which could explain paralysis and prolonged illness. We will never know for certain. What mattered to his men was that their invincible leader was suddenly, shockingly mortal. As Alexander lay dying, his generals asked him who should succeed him. According to one version, he whispered, "To the strongest." Others claim he gave his signet ring to Perdiccas, one of his officers. The ambiguity was devastating. Alexander left behind no clear heir, only a pregnant wife, Roxana, and a half-brother, Aridaeus, who was mentally impaired. The empire he had forged through blood and brilliance now stood on the brink of chaos. On June 10 or 11, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died in Babylon. He was 32 years old. His body, legend says, showed no signs of decay for days after death, a final mark of his supposed divinity. His men wept, tearing their clothes, refusing food. Babylon plunged into mourning. Across the empire, news spread with disbelief: the god-king was gone. Alexander's death left a void no one could fill. His generals, the diadochi, or successors, would soon tear the empire apart, each carving out kingdoms for themselves. The dream of a unified world empire under Alexander died with him. Yet his legacy was not lost. Cities he founded flourished, Greek culture spread across Asia, and his name lived on as a symbol of ambition without equal. Alexander's death is more than the end of a life. It is the end of an era. For his men, it was the collapse of the one figure who had bound them together. For his empire, it was the beginning of fragmentation and endless wars of succession. For history, it was the birth of the Hellenistic age, when Greek language, art, and ideas spread from the Mediterranean to India. In the end, Alexander was both mortal and myth. He died as men do, of fever, in bed, helpless. Yet he also died as no man had before, as the master of an empire that stretched across the known world, worshipped as divine, mourned as irreplaceable. His story doesn't end in Babylon. It echoes through centuries, through Rome, which idolized him, through generals who sought to emulate him, through every leader who measured greatness against his name. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, but his story didn't end there. In truth, his death was only the beginning of a second life, one lived not on battlefields but in memory, myth, and the ambitions of others. For more than 2,000 years, Alexander's shadow has loomed over history, shaping empires, inspiring conquerors, and sparking endless debates about greatness, ambition, and mortality. In the immediate aftermath of his death, chaos erupted. Alexander left no clear heir. Roxana was pregnant, and his half-brother Aridaeus was mentally unfit to rule. The generals, the diadochi, successors, seized power, each trying to carve out a piece of the empire for themselves. What followed was decades of civil wars. Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, and Cassander all fought, schemed, and betrayed one another in a bloody scramble. The empire Alexander had forged with fire and steel shattered into fragments. And yet, even as it fractured, something remarkable happened: his vision endured. Though the empire split, the Hellenistic age was born. From Egypt to India, Greek culture mingled with Persian, Egyptian, and local traditions. Cities like Alexandria in Egypt became centers of learning, trade, and science. Greek became the common language across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Philosophers debated in cities Alexander founded. Merchants traded along routes he had opened. Soldiers of mixed Greek and Asian heritage served in successor kingdoms. In many ways, Alexander's dream of fusion lived on, even if his empire did not. Later conquerors looked to Alexander as the model of greatness. Julius Caesar, upon reading of Alexander's achievements, wept that at his own age he had accomplished nothing so vast. Napoleon studied him obsessively, seeing in him both inspiration and warning. Even modern generals invoke Alexander's name when speaking of daring maneuvers and lightning strikes. For better or worse, Alexander became the yardstick by which ambition is measured. Over time, Alexander slipped from history into legend. Stories spread of him taming mythical beasts, exploring the heavens, even reaching the edge of the world where the sky meets the ocean. Medieval romances transformed him into a hero of fantasy, appearing in Persian epics, Arabic tales, and European chronicles alike. To the Greeks, he was the man who carried their culture to the ends of the earth. To Persians, he was both destroyer and inheritor. To Egyptians, he was a pharaoh. To Indians, he was a foreign invader who faced their kings with respect. To each culture, Alexander became something different: mortal, divine, villain, or hero. Even today, Alexander's life sparks endless questions. Was he a liberator or a tyrant? Did he spread culture, or destroy it? Was his death natural, or the result of betrayal? Was he truly a visionary, or just consumed by insatiable ambition? The ambiguity is part of why his story endures. He is at once brilliant and reckless, compassionate and cruel, human and divine. He defies easy answers, just as he defied limits in life. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Alexander is the idea of boundless ambition. He refused to accept the world as it was. Mountains, deserts, rivers, these weren't barriers, but challenges. His army's refusal at the Hyphasis showed that even destiny had limits, but Alexander himself never admitted it. In that sense, he embodies both inspiration and warning. Ambition can reshape the world, but it can also burn everything in its path. When we speak of Alexander today, it isn't just of a king who died young in Babylon. It is of the conqueror who dreamed of uniting East and West. Of the warrior who never lost a battle. Of the flawed, brilliant, driven man whose name still echoes across continents. His empire dissolved, his successors turned on one another, but his legend only grew stronger. Alexander the Great became more than a man. He became a symbol, a reminder of what humans can achieve, and of the cost of reaching too far. Alexander was 32 when he died. 32. In that short span, he changed the course of history more than most men do in lifetimes 10 times as long. He was a student of Aristotle, a king of Macedon, a destroyer of Persia, a pharaoh of Egypt, a god to some, and a tyrant to others. But above all, he was restless. Always forward, always seeking, never satisfied. Perhaps that's why his story still grips us today. Because somewhere, in each of us, there's a fragment of that same yearning, to go farther, to do more, to leave a mark that outlasts us. Alexander did. And for that, he remains eternal.